Okay, let me welcome everyone here today to Cold War Studies Seminar. Today's topic is looking at the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, the process that culminated in the Helsinki Final Act on 1st of August 1975, and that then led to what became known as the Helsinki process, the subsequent meetings, review conferences, in the 1970s and in the 1980s. And after the end of the Cold War, the CSCE, as it was known, the organization that had been set up to deal with the review of the Helsinki Final Act, was restyled as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, or OSCE, as it is still known today. It expanded its membership because of the breakup of the Soviet Union, of Yugoslavia, and of Czechoslovakia after the end of the Cold War. And so it now has far more members than it did when it was 35 countries during the Cold War. But Nadia Boyajieva is going to be looking at the formation of the CSCE, the Helsinki Final Act, but focusing in particular on the Soviet bloc, on Warsaw Pact countries, which were the key part of the process of setting it up. She herself is she is a visiting scholar here at the Davis Center and has been for many years, I believe 13 years, and she is also a professor of international law and international relations. What's going on here? In international relations at the Balkan Studies Institute of the Bulgarian Academy of Sciences, and also at Plovdiv University in Bulgaria. So she spends part of her time in Bulgaria and part of her time here at Harvard. So with that, let me turn to that.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me to give a seminar at the prestigious Sakharov seminar program at the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. Today, I'll be speaking about human rights and the Helsinki process and the USSR and the Soviet bloc, and how they dealt with the Helsinki process and human rights issues. By the term human rights, today I will be referring simply to the basic political, social, and economic rights and freedoms to which all human beings are entitled. These include, among others, the right to live, the right to liberty, the right to free expression, and the right to equal treatment before the law. The international human rights regimes that were organized after the Second World War were profoundly shaped by the war itself, a war that caused vastly greater destruction and misery than any other event in human history. The terrible bloodshed and upheavals of the war, culminating in Germany's mass extermination of Jews in Eastern Europe, were in the minds of Western policymakers as they sought to forge post-war agreements that would guarantee basic rights and freedoms for all individuals. However, the aftermath of the Second World War greatly complicated the prospects for the establishment of meaningful regimes on human rights. Three circumstances in particular are worth noting. First, the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin remained a tyrannical dictatorship itself and extended its influence through Central and Eastern Europe, setting up a bloc of the repressive communist regimes, dictatorships in the region. In the countries under Soviet domination, human rights were systematically violated. Second, the turmoil and human dislocation in Western Europe and the general leftward shift in European politics that resulted from the war caused US policymakers to fear that the Soviet Union would use subversion and possibly even military action to extend communist influence into Western Europe. Later on, when Western Europe, with US assistance, gradually recovered economically and prospered, US leaders were no longer so fearful of Soviet communist explanation into Western Europe. Nonetheless, they continued to worry that the Soviet Union would try to expand into East Asia and other parts of the so-called Third World, fears that were greatly heightened by the communist seizure of power in China in 1949 and the North Korean attack on South Korea in 1950. As a result, the US government was frequently willing to support authoritarian leaders in the Third World who would form a bulwark against communist expansion. The third circumstance that complicated the establishment of meaningful human rights regimes was the continued existence of European colonial empires. Britain, France, and Portugal in particular maintained sizable overseas colonies and initially were very reluctant to give them up. The difficult and often bloody process of decolonization in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s impeded the establishment and implementation of human rights norms. This context and the incipient Cold War ensured that the negotiation and enforcement of human rights accords after the Second World War would not be easy. This was evident with the 1948 Genocide Convention, the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the 1975 Helsinki Accords. All three were, in some sense, products of the Cold War, and the implementation of them was affected by the Cold War. Let me illustrate this by discussing the Helsinki Accords and their connection with the Soviet Bloc. But first, let me emphasize to the relevant archival collections that I used not only for this seminar, but also for my research on a variety of topics. Here I pointed out several important archives, primarily in Moscow, also in Kiev, in Bulgaria, in the United States, and nowadays in Belgrade, Archive of Yugoslavia. First archive is the Russian State Archive for Contemporary History, DENI. The other important archive is ГАРФ, Российский государственный архив Российской Федерации, State Archive of the Russian Federation. Another important collection we can find in the archive of the political party archive in Moscow. Other important archives are located in Kiev, and here I am citing former Ukrainian KGB archive, where I had the opportunity to work for several years before the war started. The same applies to the Russian archives located in Moscow. My last trip was in February 2022. Other important archives are located in the United States. I also mentioned here who were in institution archives. Also, U.S. National Archives and the presidential libraries contain very important collections. And I had a chance to work in the archive of Yugoslavia that is located in Belgrade, that has a lot of documents in connection to the Helsinki process and afterwards. Especially after 1975, up to the dissolution of Yugoslavia. Let me continue with my presentation. Let me start with the fact that the Helsinki Final Act was a direct product of the Cold War. But ironically, it proved to play at least a minor role in the end of the Cold War. The Helsinki Accord was negotiated among 35 countries from Europe, 33 from Europe, and North America, United States and Canada from 1973 to 1975. Some authors put other periods from 1972 to 1975. The Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe was originally sought by the Soviet Union to provide international codification of the post-war boundaries in Europe. Western governments were willing to go along with it in return for Moscow's agreement to enter into talks on limiting conventional forces in Europe, talks that ultimately led nowhere. The Soviet KGB and the state security agencies of other Warsaw Pact countries tightly controlled the news coverage of the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe negotiations, countering broadcasts from Radio Free Europe and other Western broadcast stations. Here, for example, I will show a KGB document from August 1973, which is now stored in Ergani, in Russian State Archive for Contemporary History in Moscow. And it shows efforts to counter and disrupt Radio Free Europe broadcasts pertaining to the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And here is the document. Letters are very small, unfortunately, but it explains the situation with a lot of Western European stations based in Western Europe and in the United States, and their broadcasting and the effect of their broadcasts and shows to the Eastern European audience, to the population of the countries from Soviet bloc, and measures that KGB, and not only KGB but also other security services in other communist countries should take in order to cope with this information that is coming from the West and the effect that it has to the local societies. The West European governments also sought to balance the territorial provisions of the Helsinki Accords, which the Soviet Union favored with provisions for human rights. The US government joined the West European governments in seeking human rights provisions, but was less enthusiastic about it. Under the administration of Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger played a dominant role in US foreign policy as both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. He believed that the United States should not give any significant emphasis to human rights. This was especially true in the early to mid-1970s, with the advent of a detente between the United States and the Soviet Union. At the time of warmer relations between the two superpowers, Kissinger did not want the relationship to be jeopardized by extraneous considerations of human rights. US diplomats during the Helsinki negotiations worked with their West European counterparts to arrange far-reaching provisions on human rights and human contacts, but they knew that Kissinger was relatively cynical about this part of Helsinki. Nonetheless, the final act, the Helsinki Final Act, signed by the 35 leaders, as I mentioned, on the 1st of August 1975, included numerous provisions regarding human rights in the first main part of the Act, the part titled Questions Relating to Security in Europe. Specifically, in Section 7 of Part 1A, titled Respect for Human Rights and Fundamental Freedoms, including the freedom of thought, consciousness, religion, or belief. A later main part of the Act titled Cooperation in Humanitarian and Other Fields, included provisions for family contacts, family reunification, foreign travel, information, including improvement of the circulation of access to and exchange of information, as well as cooperation in the fields of information, improvement of working conditions for journalists and other clauses, also cooperation and exchanges in the field of culture and education and other areas. The provisions on human rights did not go beyond what was already in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1976, but they did establish a human rights framework specifically for East-West relations. At the time the Helsinki Accords were signed, the human rights provisions gained relatively little attention and were overshadowed by the controversies surrounding the Western governments seeking recognition on the territorial status quo in Europe. US President Gerald Ford's decision to go to Helsinki to sign the accords came under strong protest, and many newspapers ran editorials criticizing the decision. The signing of the Helsinki Final Act even became a factor in the 1976 presidential campaign. Ford's main Republican rival, Ronald Reagan, denounced the Helsinki Agreement as a, quote, betrayal of American principles, end of quote. Ford defeated Reagan in the primaries, but the controversy weakened Ford's standing. The Democratic candidate, Jimmy Carter, echoed much of the Reagan's criticism, charging that Ford had both betrayed American values, end of quote, with the sellout of Helsinki. But Carter also criticized the Ford administration for having given inadequate emphasis for human rights in US foreign policy. After Carter narrowly defeated Ford in the November 1976 election and took office as president in January 1977, he elevated human rights to a central role in his administration's foreign policy. Over time, he came to be a strong supporter of the Helsinki Final Act's human rights provisions, the very agreement he had denounced for signing. The Soviet Bloc government in 1975 held the Helsinki Final Act for its confirmation of the territorial status quo in Europe, and they made no mention of the human rights and human context provisions. Nonetheless, some human rights activists and dissidents in the Soviet Union and other communist countries, upon seeing the full published text, took the Final Act seriously. Starting with the formation of the Moscow-Helsinki Group in 1976, this was the initiative of 11 leading dissidents, including Yuri Orlov, Lyudmila Alexeyeva, Elena Bonner, Anatoly Marchenko, and Anatoly Shtaransky. And the group that was an array of, this was the main group, and also an array of small informal groups arose in the Eastern Bloc in other countries to monitor compliance with the human rights provisions of the Helsinki Final Act. The best known of these, in addition to the Helsinki Watch groups, was Charter 77 in Czechoslovakia. It was a group of nearly 2,050 dissidents. 250. Yeah. What I said? 250 dissidents.
Don't worry about it.
I was 250 dissidents, including Václav Havel, who signed their landmark statement in January 1977, and the Workers' Defense Committee in Poland. Maybe I wish they were 2015. Because the Helsinki Final Act included provisions for follow-up meetings, this gave the Western governments, including the Carter administration and the new human rights NGOs, an opportunity to press the East Bloc governments in their violations of human rights. These meetings became an important source of international pressure. Nowadays, scholars and journalists often argue that the Helsinki Accords, through the rise of these informal human rights NGOs and the pressure brought to bear on the communist governments, accelerated the end of the Cold War. Appealing as that argument might be, it is simplistic and indeed erroneous, as Mark Kramer pointed out in a critique he published in 2016 that sparked a good deal of debate. The Soviet KGB and the state security agencies in other Warsaw Pact countries were well aware that some individuals and groups might try to exploit the CSCE Accords, and they began preparing in the summer of 1975 to crack down forcefully on any such attempts. We can see this in a top secret KGB documents stored in the state security archive in Kiev. This document is in Russian, and the document is dated from 1975. And it explains the measures that the KGB and other organs should take in fighting those new tendencies and processes in their countries, in the countries of Soviet Bloc. This is just an illustration of many documents that are already declassified and are available for researchers. Let me continue now with the conclusion that neither the Helsinki Final Act nor the initial follow-up meetings in Belgrade and Madrid nor the rise of Helsinki watch groups prevented the Soviet authorities from ruthlessly moving against the Soviet dissident movement, essentially destroying it by 1982. Similar crackdowns occurred in the other Warsaw Pact countries, largely putting an end to the human rights movements in all communist states by the early 1980s. That trend might well have intensified had it not been for a change of leadership in Moscow in 1985 and Mikhail Gorbachev's subsequent decision in 1988 to move in the direction of political liberalization, and a year later toward democratization. The fundamental change in the political climate in the USSR allowed human rights to emerge as a genuine factor in Soviet politics for the first time in history. Even though the celebrated dissident Anatoly Marchenko died after a prolonged hunger strike in Chistopol prison in December 1986, that same month marked the release of Andrei Sakharov. By 1989, with the formation of the new Congress of People's Deputies, Sakharov won election to parliament and until his death in December 1989 was able to ensure that human rights considerations were accorded greater prominence, often against the wishes of key figures in the Soviet government. Gorbachev's decision to move in this direction did not occur because he admired the Moscow-Helsinki Watch Group or other dissidents. Declassified transcripts of Soviet Politburo meetings from the mid to late 1980s underscore Gorbachev's contempt to Elena Bonner and his loathing of the entire dissident movement. Nonetheless, Gorbachev's Disdain for the human rights activists did not prevent him from gradually coming to embrace much of their agenda, if only reluctantly and grudgingly. By the end of 1980s, the Helsinki Final Act's human rights provisions were lending additional impetus to Gorbachev's political reforms. The Soviet leader began to argue that the USSR would have to live up to its international obligations if it wanted to reap the benefits of greater interaction with the West. Hence, some specific legislation was introduced in the new Soviet legislature, the Congress of People's Deputies, and to this legislature was meant to mandate compliance with the Helsinki Accords. In that sense, the Helsinki Final Act played a minor, though helpful, role in the Cold War's end. For more than 4 decades after the Second World War, the Cold War stemmed efforts to ensure greater compliance with human rights and prevented the major human rights regimes from having any real bite. But the political dynamic in Moscow that led to the end of the Cold War elevated the importance of human rights in the Soviet Union, a truly unprecedented development, and gave this issue a genuine place on the international agenda that could continue in the post-Cold War era. Thank you very much.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So let me open, if I could, just with a quick comment that could you say some, because I know you did a lot of research, you had it up there, but didn't mention, for some reason, you didn't mention the Bulgarian archives. You listed several there, but didn't mention them. And could you comment on, especially the I know you did a lot of research in the Bulgarian Foreign Ministry archive on CSCE, and did the Bulgarian authorities see things differently from the Soviet Union, or was it simply just in lockstep with what the sorts of KGB documents that you showed there? Was that the same with the Bulgarian state security and with the Bulgarian Foreign Ministry? Did they see it as their task to basically avoid any compliance with CSCE, or what was the view in Sophie?
Well, I think I actually put it in the slide the few Bulgarian important archives that are open for researchers, and especially Bulgarian State Archive is open for researchers, Bulgarian researchers and foreign researchers, as well as the archive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is open for Bulgarian researchers. Another important, actually 2 important archives that are open and that opened and declassified their collections in the recent decades. First is the archive, the military archive. That is the military archive is the main military historical archive. Not only on the Balkans, I would say that this is the main military historical archive when it comes to the collections pertaining the Warsaw Pact and NATO. And it has invaluable collections dated from the end of the Second World War, and then connected to the relations with NATO and Warsaw Pact. But among those collections, of course, there is also mentioning about, unfortunately, I didn't have that opportunity to go through that many materials. I did focus on 50s and 60s in my research, but I know that there are collections that are open and connected to the process of CSCE and especially the security dimension of the Helsinki process. So the other archive that is very important, this is the archive that is, I put it in it's here in the second slide. Unfortunately, I cannot go back for some reason. This is an archive that was recently created, and it was established by the decision of the Bulgarian parliament, and it is very it did an excellent job declassifying documents from the Cold War period, and especially from 60s, 70s, 80s, documents pertaining to the Bulgarian state security services, also to the relations between Warsaw Pact and NATO, to all important processes and tendencies that were going on not only in Bulgaria but also in all Warsaw Pact countries and generally in the Soviet Bloc. So this is archive. Here I use the abbreviation of Commission for Dossier, I would say. This is a shortened version of the long name of the archive that is open in Sofia, in the very city center. And it is very important also because invaluable documents were made available for greater audience because they were posted in collections, CD collections and DVD collections online. So everybody can just click on the website of the archive, even researchers or journalists or PhD students who don't have opportunity to come to Bulgaria, they can do research from their own countries. This archives and the Commission and the archive that did excellent job in recent 10-15 years, putting out more than 50 volumes containing documents about everything that was going on, no matter political security issues, including human rights issues and citizens' organizations that occurred in Bulgaria after 1970s up to especially their number raised in 1980s. So this archive is very important. So I would say in that Bulgarian archives I have excellent collections on that period, starting from 70s, late 60s, 70s, and 80s. And now the most important thing is that documents are now available for the researchers to do their research, no matter on what topic, including the Helsinki courts and Bulgarian input in Helsinki. I would say that on the question, the question that Mark raised at that time, Todor Živkov signed the Bulgarian leader who ruled the country 35 years, signed the Helsinki Accord, put his signature. But I would say that generally Bulgaria was extremely active. Myself, I didn't research that part of the Bulgarian contribution to the Helsinki Final Act, but Bulgarian delegation and Bulgarian members of groups that were created to develop different treaties and were extremely active. And what is, of course, at that time they couldn't go far beyond what was beyond and outside the policy that was set up by Moscow. and that was the rule for all countries from socialist bloc. What I found out is, for example, that Romania had they were also very the commission and the delegates of the commission to the Helsinki delegation. They were extremely active, and Romania had a few important proposals as well. So I think that Bulgaria was very close to what was to the main line that was set by Moscow leaders.
I'll get to you in 1 second, Josh. Just one last question on this. Do you think the Greek-Turkish war with Cyprus, which occurred during the negotiations, did that affect Bulgarian policy at all in trying to, or was it just something in the background that didn't affect?
I don't see any connection. Of course, Bulgarian policy to the Helsinki final act, and
whether Bulgaria tried to use that issue against both, especially against Turkey, but also potentially against Greece, which of course were NATO countries. So
I didn't find documents about that particular issue, but there
are some in the Soviet archives.
Okay. So
Josh,
if I had a chance to go back to Moscow, I'll make sure to
please, Josh.
for this option.
In your research, did you find any documents between the summer of '75, when the Helsinki Final Act was signed, and Gorbachev coming to power in March '85? So that's 10 years. Did you find any documents where the Soviets begin to express reservations about the fact that they signed the documents because there was ferment in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union using the documents against the communist regimes?
If I got the question right.
Well, Josh was just asking whether the rise of groups like Charter 77 and CORE, and the Helsinki watch groups, et cetera, whether that caused Soviet leaders in particular to regret that they had signed.
Well, the thing, the hopes that Soviet leaders and Moscow had trying to use the Helsinki process and signing the Helsinki Final Act. The thing is that initially, when Soviet Union, the Soviet leadership came to the idea and was very supportive of Helsinki process, that support it continues, but it turned out that goals that Moscow wanted to achieve with the Helsinki Final Act turned in some ways against the regime, because of especially because of these provisions about freedom of movement and family reunion and freedom of information and the right to get information, to spread information. Especially these provisions, I know, and this is in the documents, that these provisions were Soviet Politburo and the Soviet Union generally, and also later on the whole Warsaw Pact countries were very fearful. They were afraid of these provisions, and that's why the Helsinki Final Act wasn't, when it was put out into press and it was disseminated in Soviet Union. They did that, but without this final seventh chapter that applied to the freedom of movement, freedom of information, family reunion, etc. So it wasn't at all spread to the Soviet Union society, and including later on there were what I reading literature about this process and reading literature about how Soviet authors and later on even Russian authors looked at this process. They didn't, the documents that were put out for a long time, they didn't contain this very important part of the Helsinki Final Act that was connected to the human dimension and essentially number 7. It wasn't translated, and it wasn't so it was hidden from the society for a very long time. After the dissolution of Soviet Union, Soviet authors were able to read it openly. But after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, so this is very, very interesting. In other words, I'm not sure that Soviet Politburo and Soviet delegation and they knew what will happen after let's say after 10 years. How this Helsinki Act will affect the society, and they weren't aware, and nobody could tell what would happen in 10 years, what would be the effect of Western values and Western values of the democracies, of the effect of the spread of information, the effect of the spread of this radio broadcasting, etc., etc. Nobody knew what will be the effect, and when the effect was very negative from the point of view of leaderships in Soviet Union and in Soviet Bloc countries, because essentially what happened, a lot of groups came out, as I mentioned, different groups like in Soviet Union, we have dissidents as groups that I mentioned. And in other countries, including in Bulgaria, we have we had at that time so-called citizens groups that were very active and that wanted the government to go along with the Helsinki Final Act human rights provisions. So one of the documents that I showed during my presentation also shows indirectly, in other words, that already the Soviet Union and the government, the Soviet Union already had. So this is a document that shows. I should maybe translate it in English. This is a document that came from archive in Kiev, but essentially that document was spread in all Soviet Union republics from Moscow. This is official document, and official directive. It served as directive how to deal for KGB and other security services, not only in Soviet Union but in other countries from the Warsaw Pact countries, from Soviet Bloc countries, how to work with how to deal with what activities they should have to deal with the new processes and tendencies in the Soviet society, meaning formation of anti-Soviet movements and dissidents groups and leaders of like Andrei Sakharov and others that I mentioned, important figures that were opposing the official line, the official government line.
This was all union conference of the Soviet KGB that was held in September of 1975. So it was deliberately timed to come after.
So it's immediately after.
And there were subsequent. There was another such meeting in 1981, and another in 1984. And so it reflects it just in line with what Nadia said, to respond to your question, Josh, is you can track the KGB's view of the Helsinki Accords by looking at these from, because in this it was more of anticipating that there might be an attempt to exploit those provisions in the Helsinki Accords, but not yet really having to deal with it, but laying out measures. By 1981, which came after a great deal had happened, and there was also the crackdown that had been launched on all of those groups in all of the Warsaw Pact countries. They saw it as reinforcing the need for greater vigilance and to suppress any attempt to try to undo the measures that had been taken. But they were worried about, particularly attempts to try to infiltrate the Warsaw Pact countries. And so they saw it again as basically their mission to try to block the implementation of the Helsinki Accords. But at the same time, this was who was this? This was Piroshka, who was he was the deputy head of the KGB. So he responsible for counterintelligence and for measures against dissidents. And they understood that this was their role in society, but they didn't see it as meaning that it wasn't worthwhile to have signed the Helsinki Accords. They saw, they didn't get into that business. That was the reserve of the political leaders to decide. And I don't know, maybe Nadia would disagree, especially with regard to Bulgaria, but I never saw Soviet or say Polish documents indicating that the leaders regretted having signed the Accords despite the need to cope with these various groups. Czechoslovakia, maybe, maybe Gustav Husak at times seemed to, I wouldn't say regret, but at least to have some qualms about the broader meaning of the Helsinki Accords and whether it was worthwhile to have signed them, but not really in Moscow, not in Warsaw. What about in Sofia?
Well, in Sofia, there is a huge volume collector that I can send it to you. I mean, I can send the link to the volume. There are a lot of documents in the volume. That volume, it says state security and civil organizations in Bulgaria. So it shows how state security organs in Bulgaria, which was they dealt with newly formations. They came in Bulgarian society as a result of Helsinki Final Act and as a result of all processes of democratization and human rights ideas and provisions that came after in Bulgarian society as a result of signing Helsinki Final Act. So it's a lot of documents. The documents they're different kinds of documents. Interesting is that state security services in Bulgaria, they were doing their own job, in other words, to keep the peace in the society. And they didn't, there is no mentioning there. Because I read them carefully and I gave several presentations, I think, including in this room, maybe 10 years ago, about Bulgarian state security and civil organizations in 70s and 80s in Bulgaria up to 90s. Very interesting approach, so that state security didn't interfere in their, I would say, their activities. There were different organizations. Some organizations were connected to the right for climate the climate change and others, they were dissidents, some sort of dissidents, but in Bulgaria we didn't have such a influential dissident movement as in the USSR. But those groups were showing the effect that Bulgarian society, new ideas that were spread among Bulgarian citizens after the Helsinki final, and especially after the new waves, new ideas from the West, and also within the Soviet bloc, because in the mid-80s we have already Gorbachev coming into power, so many things change already. But interesting that what I wanted to say, that Bulgarian state security organs, they were doing their job, they didn't interfere in the activities, they wanted to prevent any demonstrations, and to impose their security measures, but they didn't comment the political decision of the Bulgarian Communist Party and Bulgarian leadership to sign Helsinki Final Act.
But definitely in the Soviet KGB documents, you can see it that they felt they had accomplished what they were supposed to do, which was to suppress the dissidence movement and to contain any prospect that unrest would lead somehow to unraveling of a communist system. So in other words, they underestimated perhaps the what would come about once Gorbachev came in. But certainly the meetings in September, this was mid-September 1975, and then in May 1981, and then in I believe it was May 1984. All of those meetings of the KGB, the leading figures in the KGB, showed that they felt they had accomplished what they had set out to do, which was to suppress the dissidence movement, to put an end to any attempt to weaken the Soviet system. So in that sense, Josh, I think it was a fairly easy call for the Soviet political leadership that they didn't call into question the decision to have signed Helsinki. But so please, and then we Bloc, please.
I just wanted to follow up on that. Do you think either of you, both of you, think that the KGB was accurate in its assessment, or did they underestimate the extent to which society had been excited by this idea of human rights?
Well, I don't know if they were aware of the effect of the human rights provisions that Helsinki Final Act contained. On the other hand, the very fact that the most important part regarding human rights dimension wasn't printed out, it wasn't shown to the Soviet Union society. That speaks itself that leadership was aware, and security services were aware that it might be the effect, that they couldn't maybe say to the scale of this effect, or do some prognosis about the scale, but they knew that it will be a negative effect to the established political and social order in Soviet Union. So that's why it wasn't translated, it wasn't published at all.
I mean, I do think, sorry to interrupt, but just, I do think that if you look at what the KGB set out to do in September 1975, well aware, because this document that Nadia has here, you refers at some length to the provisions of the Helsinki Accords, which as you mentioned, were not published in the Soviet Union, just in part. But the human rights provisions are cited here at some length, and they see these as things that some in the Soviet Union might try to exploit. And so they were well aware that there might be such attempts. but they probably initially underestimated the effect that it might have, particularly with the formation of the Helsinki watch groups and the efforts by others in the Soviet Union to try to actually make the Soviet Union live up to its own laws. But by 1981 and 1984, I think they had accurately judged that they had contained the threat that they faced, which was significant, a significant threat. But then one thing that is also quite clear from that document that's no longer there is that they saw détente as here's where you can see a divergence between the state security officials and the political leadership, because generally political leaders favored détente. The state security did not, because they saw it as opening up avenues for subversive influences to try to get into the Soviet Union, or at least to have broadcasts. And so they tended to dislike periods of good relations. They saw hostile relations as so much better. And so by the early 80s, the relations were very hostile. So that's part of it.
In the documents, it says just in short that comrades, our country now it's in the eve of a very important event in the life of the Communist Party, and this is 25th Congress of the Communist Party. So we have to get prepared. So the document was issued half a year before the Congress, 25th Congress, CS, as it says here, was held. So they already knew, they saw the changes in the society, the KGB, of course, but I'm not sure. And I think that political leadership already
changes in connection though with the détente. I think at this point it was more in connection with détente. Like things like being able to have telephone communications, which first began in the early 70s. I mean, it's still extremely difficult, but you could use a telephone more regularly. And so there were numerous things that gave greater potential for dissident movements or protest movements to organize.
I just wanted to add to that. I was in Hungary in '76, starting in September. And my impression was, I distinctly remember talking to people about the Helsinki Accords. And so they knew, I mean, these were other graduate students or professors or historians, librarians, not the average person perhaps. They were aware of the provisions of the Helsinki Accords, and they were somewhat dissidents themselves, and they considered it, it's not going to do us any good. Our security forces will figure out some way of suppressing it.
In connection to what you were saying, I just went through a document from the Bulgarian state security services that was mentioned the effect of Radio Free Europe, because the broadcasting of Radio Free Europe was the broadcasts were well. I mean, in Hungary, it was different matter, but for Bulgarian society, because Hungary was much more open than what
Hungary didn't jam Radio Free Europe.
It didn't, but Bulgaria did.
Yeah, oh sure.
So that's why the Bulgarian security services, they said, so see what is going on in Hungary, and those broadcasting of not only Radio Free Europe, but also Radio Liberty and others in that country, it will come to Bulgaria and will have a problem.
Right.
Yeah.
I should add, Hungary also, because it was a less repressive system, so people had gotten accustomed to a somewhat greater openness anyway, and therefore, they didn't see that there was as much potential to push for more. I mean, it's still a repressive communist system, but nowhere near as repressive as, say, in Bulgaria, or especially Romania and East Germany and Czechoslovakia. It's not Czechoslovakia. So So that's another, I mean, the Hungarians, for example, were able to travel abroad.
Right, but you
Much
said
more
they didn't
easily.
have, they didn't want to push for more dissidents?
Generally, I think that they were worried if they pushed for more than everything.
Well, they did push for more.
Only to a degree.
But I remember one.
I mean, I would say overall in Hungary, the degree of timidity was quite significant. But I mean, I remember even, there were some individuals who were bolder, but
Right,
Hungarian society as a whole, I would say,
Yeah.
was quite cowed by the experience of 1956. But and that remained the case even into 1989. I mean, Hungary moved very far early on as did Poland, but it wasn't so much from pressure from below. It was
Right.
much more elite driven. Unlike, say, in Czechoslovakia, East Germany, where it was definitely. But Nikolai.
Yes, I was just wondering if those dissident organizations weren't there attempts to be infiltrated by informers or people who work for the state security services so they can control their activities? I remember in '89 there was an organization, Eco Glasnost, if you remember, the people who were dealing with the pollution from Romania. This was one of the major cities on Danube River in Bulgaria, Ruse. So there were some speculations that there were people who were infiltrated in this organization, Eco Glasnost, just to control them and to manipulate. So I was wondering if there are any documents related to this, especially in Bulgaria.
In Bulgaria, there are a lot of documents, and they're readily available. As I mentioned already, they were published in a hard copy. Some of them, of course, and on DVD and on the CD that are available on the website of the archive that I mentioned. And so, what the Bulgarian state security, as I said, the task wasn't to interfere, but the task was to monitor, to watch, to follow the activities of these so-called citizens organizations. They call them citizens organizations, new kinds of organizations that Bulgarian society didn't have until now, didn't experience. And that was new for Bulgaria. So they weren't regarded even as a dissidents. They were regarded as some new formations that might be dangerous for the rest of the society, with their open-minded ideas, Western ideas, ideas for human rights, etc. One of them was this Eco Glasnost that appeared. It was very influential, but as I mentioned, in Bulgaria, they were such small organizations. In sometimes they were up to a few hundred people, and state security didn't do anything. Just they were monitoring their activity, and they also, of course, had their own. I would say their own people that were infiltrated into the organizations in order to follow the next step of the organizations and the influence that those organizations were getting from outside world, from Western world, or even from the Soviet Union, because after 1985, especially in the Soviet Union, we have, and before that, even from late 1970s, we have a very influential Soviet dissident movement. So all those ideas, of course, came to Bulgaria.
Yeah, I should add that in the document, the KGB document that the second that was one of their tasks, was to infiltrate groups, and they refer to it quite explicitly in that document. And in East Germany, in Poland, Romania, Czechoslovakia, there were systematic efforts made to infiltrate groups, often with considerable success. In Poland, for example, which was another country where the communist system wasn't as harsh as it was elsewhere, but there were in Solidarity, for example, which wasn't really a product of Helsinki Accord so much. That was much more of the Workers' Defense Committee core, where Solidarity emerged quite separately. But in 1980-81, the Polish Security Service, the equivalent of the KGB, made a systematic effort to try to infiltrate Solidarity, and they did have success, but the Solidarity was so big that it really didn't hinder its operation until martial law was imposed. But one thing that has been interesting is there's been a great deal of research done on this question of informants, people who were seeming to be part of dissident organizations, but were actually working for the state security. And Jens Giesecke and the former East Germany and numerous Stefano Bottoni and looking at Romania and several others. What they found was that the number of informants was, especially in East Germany, was lower than many people had thought at the time. But what was more important was that people assumed that informants were pervasive. And so they tended to self-censor and not to engage in anything that they saw as risky. So even though the number of informants was not huge in some cases, they achieved their purpose by making people think it was huge. And, so a place.
I thank you for your fascinating and succinct but poignant talk. I have a question. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about how the following up meeting of this Helsinki process helped the human rights group to imposing pressures on the government, and especially when, as you mentioned, that KGB and the Bulgaria security authorities were very reluctant to make the fully translation of the human rights status. So how do this human rights group manage to use this process to form pressures on government?
The review conferences. Like the Madrid Review Conference and the Belgrade Review Conference and others, did they attempt?
Well, did they have a major effect on?
No, did the particular groups, the groups you referred to, did they try to use these review conferences?
Well, in Bulgaria, I don't recall any group. First of all, it was very early for Bulgarian society to have such influential groups that would use for other countries. For example, for Yugoslavia, this is different matter because Yugoslavia was a unique country within the architecture at that time, not only in Europe but also in the third world. So what was the effect? I would say that I don't know. Maybe in Soviet Union, there were groups. As I mentioned, one of them was the Helsinki Watch Group, and also Soviet Union had a very influential dissident movement, very magnetic, with leading figures. So that in other countries, maybe with the exception of Václav Havel, in Czechoslovakia, and I don't know any others that are so influential to say that with their activity they can change the general line of certain government.
But they did, you know,
They did.
in Czechoslovakia, Charter 77, and in Poland,
Yeah,
they
they
certainly
took-
tried to use those review conferences. But the efforts themselves became a pretext for a crackdown on them. So the 1981 meeting of the Soviet KGB showed that they understood that there could be attempts to appeal to these review conferences. And that had already been the state security in Czechoslovakia had begun cracking down when the Belgrade Review Conference was coming up. I think it was in 1977. Yeah, the Czech in Charter 77 had been signed. Maybe it was about 6 months before. And so the state security in Czechoslovakia understood that there might be attempts to use the Belgrade Review Conference. And so they began arresting people preemptively. So they understood that there could be these attempts. Please, Tatiana.
Actually, a little comment to what you were talking about and to your question, additional information, so to speak.
I should add, this is Tatiana Yankelevich, who is the stepdaughter of Andrei Sakharov. So
yes, and as such, I was squeezed out of the Soviet Union.
and she herself was forced out.
Daughter
On September 5th, 1977, we crossed the border, leaving the Soviet Union, and my husband, in his underwear, hid an appeal from the Mordovian labor camps. From the people who were already incarcerated prior to that, and not because of their Helsinki watch group activity, but for their dissident activity. One of them was Kranit Lubarsky, actually, who was one of the basically a few authors of the idea of the day of political prisoner, which is similar to the concept of Amnesty International, who is represented here by Joshua, so it's similar to the concept of the prison of conscience. And so the idea of the day of political prisoner was originated from the Soviet labor camps, and Kranit Lubarsky and I think some Ukrainian, I can't remember exactly who, Zaryan Papadyuk maybe, or someone like that, were inmates at the time in the Mordovian labor camp in, what is it, Sosnovka or something like that. And so they have started a hunger strike to proclaim the day of political prisoner, which since then has been going on October 30th, and Memorial accepted, Memorial Society, or in Russian, Общество, Международное общество Memorial, have established that day in the much later years as the day of the so-called the return of the names, возвращение имен, the action when all the names of all the people that perished under the Soviet totalitarian regime are read publicly. Now the memorial is no more, but this action is still going on. So in 1977, Efrem Minkevich smuggled this document, and we tried to get it over to the Belgrade conference, which was taking place shortly afterwards, sometime in the fall of 77. And it was very clear. I'm not sure of any such attempt before that, because it was just 2 years after the Helsinki Accord was signed. This was the first review conference, unless I'm mistaken.
No,
And
yes, it was the first.
It was the first, exactly, of course, 75 and 70. And so all the consequent review conferences, there were a lot of attempts with the help of Western media, with the help of soon to be established Helsinki Watch in New York by Robert Bernstein, who was a Random House president, a publisher, and who became very much involved in human rights, publishing human rights literature, publishing prescribed books, prescribed authors here in the United States. And he was the founder of Helsinki Watch, which then became Human Rights Watch, which is now a worldwide movement. So, and he got his inspiration from the Moscow Helsinki group. And he was actually the person, he basically almost solely responsible for publishing Sakharov's early work since late 1960s. And he was a very prominent man in the publishing world and very influential. And so he was behind, I'm sorry, I'm carrying on.
But also that we should
Yeah, yeah.
mention the role of Ed Klein.
Yeah, Edward Klein,
Yeah.
who was his friend, who was not affiliated with any established one. He was on the committee of New York Amnesty International for a while, but basically it was. So anyhow, there were people in the West, and they all tried to contribute to pressure the review conferences to address the issues raised in the many appeals, including from prisons and labor camps. And it was practically always completely futile. And of course, the Soviet representatives of the, the Soviet counterparts to these review conferences put a lot of opposition and undermining all these efforts to bring the attention of the review conferences to the flagrant violations of human rights to which the Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries have been bound by their participation in the Helsinki Accords. And I personally, just one more footnote, in Ottawa, I think it was 1983, review conference in Ottawa in Canada. My brother and I traveled there to press for the plight of our parents, who were at the time already for 3 years in the internal exile, completely extrajudicial, never, anyhow. What was his first name? Arbatov, you remember?
Georgi.
Georgi.
He was the director of Soviet Institute of
USA Canada.
US Canada Institute. And he was authorized on the very high level to say whatever, but of course he was also instructed. And so we learned from some of the people who were at the conference representing other Western countries. They told us in confidence that Arbatov went around spreading horrible
That would be typical.
lies about my brother and myself. It was quite extraordinary that a man of his stature would stoop so low to
Wouldn't surprise me at all, having known Arbatov. I would never underestimate how slimy he could be. When he published his memoirs in the 1990s, I don't remember exactly when, and Dick Pipes wrote a review of them, and the title of the review was "The Toady." Which I
But it's interesting, Mark, that a person of such a stature would bow to the instructions and just
not with Arbatov. Arbatov was he was a loyal mouthpiece of Kremlin propaganda. Last question, please.
An anomaly, seems to me, is the relationship of Ford to Kissinger. And Kissinger's view towards Helsinki doesn't seem to make sense relative to Ford saying he's supported it. As a Republican, I wouldn't necessarily expect Ford would support it. I tend to think that would come from the Democrats. Kissinger. So the question would be, what would be Kissinger's motivation? You mentioned it, but you didn't really explain what Kissinger's motivation was behind not supporting Helsinki. And then, of course, that ultimately led to the demise of Ford, because Ford couldn't do anything right. So in this case, apparently he couldn't do anything right either. And then later on, after the suppressions have occurred, Gorbachev is opposite Reagan, and they establish a totally different relationship, which basically signifies the end of the Soviet Union. And part of that may be that when you have a repressive reaction, that allows for the blade to kind of cut the past into the future. And then all of a sudden, all of these efforts to suppress human rights movements began to backfire, and the Soviet Union suddenly disintegrates.
But yeah, I mean, with Henry, just very
Well,
quickly with Henry
maybe
Kissinger.
say-
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I would say just one sentence. I think that his view on human rights provision was that he was very cynical about human rights. I mentioned he didn't think that it has any effect or great effect on the relations east west relations.
I mean, I think, it's not that Kissinger saw it as totally unimportant, but he saw it as really secondary to what he saw as the major security issues the United States had to deal with. And human rights should be, maybe not
Secondary,
the lowest priority,
lowest.
but pretty low.
It can cause a lot of trouble if they get out.
Ford, I think, Ford had because he'd been a congressman for a long while from the region of Michigan that had a lot of former East European people of East European descent, and they tended to have quite a bit of importance. And I think that probably influenced in part Ford's approach, but it was also just a different, he and Kissinger were quite different in a lot of ways. But he'd also inherited Kissinger, from Nixon, because it was Nixon who appointed Kissinger first as National Security Advisor and then simultaneously as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, the only person who's ever served simultaneously. So he served for close to 2 years as both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. Ford inherited him and eventually appointed a separate National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft. But at the time that Helsinki was being negotiated, it was all Kissinger there. And so that's, I mean, regardless of what Kissinger thought, that Ford was definitely going to go, even though there was a lot of pressure on it. It was not your match.
Nuclear balancing.
Well, that was, there was a separate nuclear arms talks, but we're gonna need to add Nadia. So last word.
The last word. I would say that the Helsinki process was an extremely important process in diplomatic history of not only Europe, but I think of the Cold War history as well, but also goals and ideas that, for example, Soviet leadership had when entering the process, and American leadership had in mind when approaching the Helsinki process, as also the Western European countries. Each of the countries approached the Helsinki process with its own goals and ideas. It turned out that after signing the agreement and in a decade afterwards, the situation in Europe changed so drastically nobody expected, nobody wanted the dissolution of Soviet Union when American government and Western European governments came to the table of negotiations. So the situation and the processes changed so drastically and dramatically, and nobody could predict this when they came, the delegations, when they came to Helsinki to work on details of Helsinki Final Act. So there is a lot of debate in the literature among scholars, journalists, political scientists. Was it good for Europe to have Helsinki process or not? What was it for better or for worse for the political
I don't think
agenda?
it was for worse.
Yeah, it wasn't for worse, but what happened? We have dissolution of the at the end in late 80s, dissolution of the Soviet Bloc, dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the very bloody dissolution of the biggest Slavic federation, Yugoslavia. But overall, I think that Helsinki process was a very positive process and experience, diplomatic experience in the Cold War history.
Very good. Thank you very much. And thank you to